Hello and welcome back. In this fifth series of sense, Deleuze is going to take us inside sense and give us some clues on how he considers sense. He starts off by saying that since we can find sense on both sides of the dualities mentioned in the previous series, that between things and language, between nouns and verbs, or between denotations and expressions, that we then need to develop a series of paradoxes about sense to try to explore it further. But remember, these are paradoxes, so if you don't understand it at first, well then join the club. The first paradox he mentions is that of infinite regress. He says that we can't begin making a proposition, we cannot denote anything without sense already being presupposed. He says that a proposition has a sense of its own, but that sense is not stated in the proposition. The only way you can state the sense of a proposition is to make another proposition whose object is the sense of the previous proposition. But that particular proposition has sense to it that's different than the sense that it states of the object of the first proposition. Therefore, to state the sense of the second proposition, you need to make yet a third proposition that has the object of sense for the second proposition. In other words, you can't make a statement and convey its sense at the same time. It always requires another proposition. Hence, infinite regress. He's going to give a couple of examples from Lewis Carroll. The first one, and I want to say that the examples that he gives in this series, to me, say a lot. They're very important. They're not random examples that he gives, but they have their own kind of narrative, I would say. The first example he gives is in the Alice stories when Alice encounters the knight and she wants to know the name of a song. And so the knight tells her and she says, oh, that is the song. The song is such and such name. And the knight says, no, that is the name of what the song is called. But that's not the name of the song itself, and they go back and forth on this, and this is Deleuze's way of exemplifying this infinite regress of sense. The second example he gives is when Alice is in the company of the Duchess, and the Duchess is finding a morality in every story, and it's worth reading. Quoting exactly what she says. "The game's going on rather better now," Alice said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round." "Somebody said," Alice whispered, "that it's done by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, it means much the same thing," said the Duchess. "And the moral of that is, take care of the sense and the sounds will take care of themselves." So I'll get back to these examples and why I feel they're important. The second paradox Deleuze brings up, he calls the paradox of sterile division or dry reiteration. And this is the alternative to the paradox of infinite regress, because this is where he says you freeze a proposition and extract the sense from it. In relation to this, Deleuze will say that the Stoics discovered the sterility of the sense event. Only bodies can act and suffer, not the incorporeal entities which are the results of their actions and passions. Extracted from the proposition, sense is independent of it, since it suspends all affirmation and negation. but nevertheless is its evanescent double. And Deleuze will use the example, and I'll quote, Carroll's smile without the cat, or flame without a candle. Deleuze will call the third paradox of sense the paradox of neutrality, or of essence's third estate. Sense is the same in propositions which oppose each other. First example he gives is God is not, must have the same sense. Sense is always a double sense. Sense gets established in inverse relations all at once. That's why it's the same in both directions of the proposition. He'll use some examples from Lewis Carroll of propositions, of opposing propositions which express the same sense. Cats eat bats. Bats eat cats. I say what I mean has the same sense of I mean what I say. And then the last example is the most important in my opinion. He'll bring up the final chapter of Sylvie and Bruno, in which Sylvie gets presented with two jewels. Each jewel has a different proposition. On the red jewel it says, all will love Sylvie. And on the blue jewel is the second proposition, Sylvie will love all. And then it's discovered that these jewels are really both halves of the same jewel. And this is important. If you actually read that chapter in Sylvie and Bruno, which you should not skip to the end, you should try to read the whole story. But at the end of Sylvie and Bruno, it basically expresses what in magic is called love is the law. So that's, and earlier he mentioned, used the example of 'tis love that makes the world go round. The fourth paradox of sense Deleuze will look at in this series is the paradox of the absurd, or of impossible objects. Propositions which are contradictory within themselves, where their denotation can't be fulfilled and they have no signification. Without any signification, they're absurd. And examples he gives is a square circle, a mountain without a valley, a perpetual motion machine, things like that. He'll say that it's important to not confuse the absurd with nonsense. And he'll look at nonsense and how nonsense can make a donation to sense in a further series. Now I'd like to turn to and introduce a book that's a commentary on logic of sense. It's this one, Gilles Deleuze's Logic of Sense, A Critical Introduction and Guide, and it's by James Williams. And he has a lot of insight to offer. I don't agree with everything he says. One thing he points out I found interesting is that in the French edition at the beginning of this series, Series 5, Deleuze begins with the words translated into English as, but since sense, and then he goes on. The English translator omitted the opening, the but since. He just starts with sense. And Williams will make the point. He'll basically say this is a literary technique of Deleuze to try to provoke sense. That when the reader is confronted with the words but since, he immediately goes back to the previous series to look at where, what Deleuze is talking about. And he'll find the previous series ends with the quote from the gardener's song from Sylvie and Bruno. And thus, according to Williams, the reader will have the sense of the absence of sense. So Deleuze, he's calling this a literary technique. And I agree with him that the logic of sense is more than just a book presenting information. It's actually a book meant to provoke thought and meant to provoke the reader through through various literary techniques that Deleuze will employ. For instance, another one, there are paradoxes within paradoxes. So you remember one of the paradoxes of sense was its dryness. Yet one of the words he uses for sense is the Latin word a liquid. And this word means, in English, it means a somewhat or something. In other words, it doesn't have a definite meaning, so it's interesting to me that Deleuze uses this Latin phrase because obviously the sense of the word a liquid, it makes you think of something liquid. But yet sense, he says, is dry. So he's putting paradoxes within paradoxes to provoke the reader into thinking. And there's another quote from this book. There are good reasons for this esotericism and Baroque form in terms of how Deleuze writes. Deleuze is describing complex and ubiquitous enfolded processes that cannot be framed in a language that allows a return to prior identities. The danger of this return is a key factor in his account of images of thought, since the mere repetition of traditional terms increases the risk of presupposing the images we wish to escape by strengthening their hold through habits of thought. So in other words, Deleuze is attempting to use language to break us out of the habit of how we normally think and that the assumptions we normally rely upon. So from the magic point of view, the fifth series reminds me that the fifth tarot trump is called the Hierophant, and it's the function of the Hierophant to communicate the secrets of the temple. Well, what has Deleuze communicated from the temple in this series? The examples that he's given, the first one was music, in terms of what is the song called. He talked about the propositions God is not. He mentioned love, used the example, love makes the world go round. And then the end of Sylvie and Bruno, which basically states love is the law. And so that's it. And we'll see you next time.